The Adrian College Media Production House provides opportunities for students to learn and grow live on the airwaves, just like Matt Kibbe.
I've gotten a chance to create a relationship with coaches and teams and learn more from people instead of trying to teach myself something. Got an opportunity to expand my knowledge of sports, hone in on my skills as a broadcaster, and learn about equipment in different ways. You get more of a connection with professors as well. Providing
opportunities, growing leadership. The Adrian College Media Production House. Thanks for tuning in. Adrian College is looking for leaders, student athletes with the tenacity to keep the Bulldogs at the top, the forefront, in and out of the classroom. The Bulldogs are looking for talent, character, hard work, grit, leaders who can electrify sold-out crowds, got out a last-line shift, will their team to victory, hit a grand slam in the bottom of the ninth, and be a part of a legend in the making. Think you have what it takes to become a Bulldog? Visit adrian.edu to learn more.
Bulldog fans, connect with Adrian College TV on social media to be updated when we're broadcasting live, to see highlights, plays of the week, and much more. Adrian College Television is on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. ACTV's handle is at Adrian College TV on every form of social media. Thank you for tuning in and subscribing to the home of the Bulldogs, Adrian College TV.
Adrian College is a pinpoint like no other. With our 77 undergraduate degrees, 47 majors, and 21 broad fields of study, Adrian has a one-of-a-kind, hands-on learning experience for everyone. Do you want to visit the campus of Adrian College in person? Visit adrian.edu/campus-visit. Again, that's adrian.edu/campus-visit. Come take in the beautiful facilities at Adrian College for yourself.
If there was one word I was going to use to describe the communication arts program at Adrian College, it would be unique. Students find themselves on the radio, in front of and behind the camera, and directing their own programs. Students learn in a personalized environment that sets them up for a world of opportunities. Are you ready for your moment in the limelight? Learn more about the Rush Communications Center and Adrian College's communications program by visiting adrian.edu today.
I'm Matt Kibbe, the current student body president here at Adrian College. I chose AC because the campus simply feels like home. Everywhere I go, I know the amenities are there to help me succeed and get to the next level in my career. If you want to see what Adrian College has to offer, you can schedule an in-person visit at adrian.edu/campus-visit.
Adrian College has dozens of athletics programs, and winning is a staple on our campus. We have the culture of winning in and out of the classroom. This is a place where young men and women grow into professionals for life. Are you interested in learning more about the Bulldog experience? Visit adrianbulldogs.com and the Recruit Me tab to be recruited to play your sport of choice today. If you have what it takes, you could be a Bulldog in no time.
Adrian College Television would like to give a big thank you to our sponsor, Carlton Lodge of Adrian. Carlton Lodge is sponsoring all ACTV broadcasts during the 2021 to 2022 school year. Located at 1629 West Maumee in Adrian, Carlton Lodge offers comfortable rooms and suites at affordable rates. There's also a heated indoor and outdoor pool, along with a 24-hour fitness center. Thank you for the continued support toward Adrian College Television.
Adrian College is looking for leaders, student athletes with the tenacity to keep the Bulldogs at the top, the forefront, in and out of the classroom. The Bulldogs are looking for talent, character, hard work, grit, Leaders who can electrify sold-out crowds, gut out a last-line shift, will their team to victory, hit a grand slam in the bottom of the ninth, and be a part of a legend in the making. Think you have what it takes to become a Bulldog? Visit adrian.edu to learn more.
Adrian College has once again been recognized for its commitment to engaged, experiential education by Colleges of Distinction, a one-of-a-kind guide for college-bound students. While higher education has changed over the past 20 years, Colleges of Distinction's selection process has stayed consistent and accepting only those that adhere to the 4 distinctions: engaged students, great teaching, vibrant community, and successful outcomes. Overlaid in the last few years have been a look into high-impact practices. They believe most critical to the student experience were the kinds of engaging experience that are found at Adrian College. To learn more, please visit adrian.edu.
On Tuesday, April 6, 2021, I was sitting in my office and an email popped into my inbox from someone in your graduating class today. The email said, "Dear President Docking, back in August I had emailed you in regards to the state of the well-being of the campus community during the COVID spike. At that time, I was incredibly anxious about the prospect of spending my senior year of college sitting at my kitchen table in my hometown trying to finish my seminar projects in the event we switched to all online learning. As I type this email now in April, I cannot describe to you the gratitude that my fellow students and I have for Adrian remaining open on campus for the duration of the school year. I wanted to take the time to thank the Adrian College community, the faculty, the staff, for allowing us to have as normal of a year as possible.
Provided invaluable support to the Romney Institute during the critical stages of its infancy. Not only was he the Institute's first guest speaker, delivering a bravura presentation on Constitution Day 2010, he was also a constant source of wise counsel and advice. Soon thereafter, Professor Bogoski suffered a debilitating stroke while engaged in the craft he had mastered better than nearly anyone else, teaching constitutional law. In 2019, he passed away. I'm especially thankful today that Professor Bogoski's wife, Mary, and colleague, Dean Tracy Brame of the Cooley Law School are with us today to honor his memory and to help perpetuate Professor Bogoski's legacy of curiosity and examination of the Constitution. I'm proud to present Professor Keith Whittington to deliver today's address. Professor Whittington is the William Nelson Cromwell Professor of Politics at Princeton University. In addition to being one of the leading constitutional scholars in the country, Professor Whittington is also one of the founders of the Academic Freedom Alliance, a nonpartisan organization of academics committed to protecting fearless, independent thought on our college campuses. Professor Whittington's address is titled "Freedom of Thought and the Struggle to End Slavery." I'm confident it will inspire us to think of constitutional rights in new, challenging ways. Please join me in welcoming him to our campus.
So thank you. I appreciate you all coming out. I gather this talk has some particular resonance on this college campus, given the history of the college. I'm particularly pleased to be able to talk about this with you today. I've been increasingly occupied with free speech issues over the last several years in a variety of contexts. This talk is part of a large project now that I'm beginning to think of fights over free speech and the struggle to expand the scope of free speech in the United States across American history. This is an enduring and long-lived battle, ultimately. We have not simply emerged from our founding era with a single conception of free speech that has been preserved in stable form ever since. Rather, we've continued struggle over what the boundaries of free speech ought to be, how we ought to think about the protections for free speech, especially over the course of the 20th century. That's led to a substantial expansion of the scope of free speech recognized by courts and in our practices more generally. And it was often progressives who were the ones who were leading that fight to expand free speech generally. They did so not simply for the sake of free speech per se, but in order to advance other causes that they fundamentally cared about, and the free speech was a necessary handmaiden to fighting for other kinds of causes or other substantive causes within the political arena more generally. Robust protections for free speech ultimately have been vital for the fight for equality, justice, and social progress across American history. Somewhat oddly, however, the positions have now, to a significant degree, become reversed, and some of that history has been forgotten. Conservatives have come around to valuing free speech more than they once did. It was often conservatives who were pressing for more restrictive views of free speech. Perhaps they're making that turn yet again. But for the last few decades, conservatives have taken a much more libertarian turn toward how they thought about free speech more generally. But at that same time, as conservatives began to embrace free speech, liberals became increasingly indifferent to or skeptical of free speech. This has been a broad shift that's evident in the activism on the streets, but it's also evident in public opinion polls generally. So recent surveys have found, for example, that Americans are still most likely to support the right to say what you want than the rest of the world. For example, Americans continue to have, and they have for many years now, held a relatively libertarian perspective on free speech compared to other advanced industrial democracies, for example, certainly as opposed to places that are not fully democratic. But self-identified Republicans have become more supportive of free speech and become, in fact, the most supportive group in these recent polls for free speech. And the Democrats have increasingly become the least supportive group of free speech, which is a dramatic reversal of what we would have seen just a few decades ago in these same opinion polls. Moreover, it's only a bare majority of millennials, but certainly nearly all of the so-called silent generation that are supportive of free speech. We've seen a real decline, and not only a flip between conservatives and liberals, but a real decline across age groups as to how supportive people become of free speech more broadly. So it's worth, in this immediate context, going back and thinking about some history as to how did we get the kind of robust free speech protections we have now, and why do people think those are valuable in the first place. And I want to start briefly with an English philosopher and liberal reformer, John Stuart Mill, who was writing in Great Britain in the early part of the 19th century. He offered one very prominent rationale for why we ought to value free speech that's particularly relevant to thinking about the university context in particular, and that is, he argued that free speech was essential to the search for truth. That if we wanted to have confidence about our ideas, we wanted to have confidence about our opinions, how the world works in general, we had to be willing to submit our ideas to critical inquiry by others. We had to be willing to hear criticisms, think through the responses to those criticisms in order to become more confident that we actually held the right ideas and for the right reasons. Ultimately, in the early 20th century, Alexander Meiklejohn, who was an American reformer, an important progressive higher education leader, president of Amherst College for a time until the conservative alumni forced him out of that particular position, an important free speech scholar in the early part of the 20th century in the United States. He added a second very important rationale, which was not central to Mill's thought, but it's become also quite important to Howard Fort in the United States in particular has thought about free speech over time. And as he's argued that free speech is critical to the functioning of democracy more generally, that a crucial component of having a democratic political system is the ability to criticize government officials in order to force government officials to hear those criticisms, in order to try to inform voters as to what public policies we ought to adopt, how we ought to think about how government operates more generally, bring forward the kinds of concerns that we have about society that we want government to respond to, and the kinds of concerns that we have for the government itself and how it's behaving more broadly. And if we're going to have a robust and stable and meaningful democracy, Meiklejohn argued, we ultimately would need to have a robust conception of free speech to go along with it. Honorable Wendell Holmes, a justice on the U.S. Supreme Court in the early part of the 20th century, emphasized in his writings, and including writings that led to this kind of expansion of the scope of free speech on the U.S. Supreme Court, he emphasized the Constitution is made for people of fundamentally differing views. We need to understand the operation of the Constitution in a way that's consistent with the fact that people are going to have fundamental disagreements about how we ought to govern ourselves. And what the United States is fundamentally committed to is hearing out those commitments and allowing us to move forward. This, in part, is an important shift that occurred in politics broadly conceived from politics being primarily about violence and force. Early rationales for how you operate a government more generally is the most forceful, most violent, most coercive parts of society ultimately got to govern, and the government was a reflection of that power to insist on how people were going to live. Part of the earliest rationales even for voting and majority rule within politics, the shift toward democracy, was ultimately that it was easier to determine where the real weight of force was, that we would simply model what forceful fighting would look like by getting a show of hands as opposed to people actually having to go out into the street and fight with one another. Obviously, not everyone always thinks in these terms that we ought to govern ourselves through argumentation and elections rather than simply force of will. But importantly, politics has become increasingly, across the 20th century in particular, certainly within the United States, as one that emphasizes conversation, deliberation, persuasion as the way in which we determine what it is the government ought to do moving forward. And one of these important moments of persuasion and deliberation within American history is the rise of the anti-slavery movement and the fight to end slavery more generally, although obviously the fight to end slavery also had an important place for the use of force as part of that as well. James Freeman Clark, who's pictured here, was a prominent Unitarian minister in Boston across this period, an active reformer in a variety of causes, including the anti-slavery cause. And after the Civil War, he wrote a review of a book about the rise and fall of slavery more generally. And he wanted to characterize how we ought to think about that recent history for him and how we ought to think about the rise and fall of slavery within the United States, was fundamentally one of a basic confrontation between two different forces in American society. On the one hand, he thought were the forces that used weapons of force and coercion and worldly interest, and that was fundamentally the weapons that the slave power possessed. On the other hand, what anti-slavery forces brought to bear in this battle were the weapons of faith and man and the truth. That ultimately the anti-slavery forces were trying to persuade their fellow citizens about the wrongfulness of slavery in order to try to move the country past it. Clark thought that leads to a certain optimistic lesson about the way humanity works in general and the way democracies work in particular. No evil, he thought, however mighty, no abuse, however deeply rooted, can resist the power of the truth, faithfully uttered and steadily applied. If this great institution of slavery, resting on such a foundation of enormous pecuniary interests, buttressed by such powerful supports, fell in the life of a single generation before the unaided power of truth, why should we ever despair? But he recognized, to this we must add, that it is only where free institutions exist that truth has the full power in such a conflict. We need free speech, a free press, free schools, and free churches in order that truth may have a free course. The great advantage of a republic like ours, he thought, is that it gives to truth a fair chance in its conflict with error. The struggle to abolish slavery was also a struggle to secure and extend free speech. The victory of the anti-slavery movement was also a victory ultimately for free speech and freedom of thought, was a necessary condition for the eventual success of the anti-slavery movement in abolishing slavery. And this is reflected certainly in the early political organizing of the anti-slavery movement more generally. This comes from the party platform of 1843 of the Liberty Party, which was the first national anti-slavery political party in the United States. And as you can see among its planks of its platform in that presidential campaign of the 1840s was freedom of speech, press, and petition, which the platform characterized as sacred and inviolable. That commitment to free speech, that highlighting of the importance of freedom of speech and freedom of the press, resonated all through the anti-slavery movement leading up to the Civil War. So the Free Civil Party, which succeeded the Liberty Party, its presidential banner, which reflected here from the presidential election of 1848, in which Martin Van Buren and Charles Francis Adams ran for the presidency under this banner. You see at the very top of this campaign poster was the Temple of Liberty, and atop the Temple of Liberty was the slogan, "Free soil, free labor, and free speech." The Republican Party embraced that same slogan when it formed in the aftermath of the Free Soil Party. This is the Republican Party presidential banner of 1856, with John Fremont and William Dayton carrying the banner for the Republican Party at the time. Here, instead of the Temple of Liberty, they have a farmer plowing his fields. In there, too, is the Republican Party slogan, "Free labor, free speech, free territory." This is embodied, for example, in the Wide Awake Club, which was a adjunct of the Republican Party. Marchers for the Republican Party in the streets were given these certificates to indicate their membership in the Wide Awake Club, and the prominent motto of the Wide Awake Club as well, "Free speech, free soil, and free men." The Republican Party platform of 1860 similarly emphasized this, emphasized that we must have a union that shall be preserved, but also a union that was committed to free speech, free homes, and free territory. So why was free speech so important to these early anti-slavery political movements in general? Why is it at the top of the agenda such that it deserved a place right alongside free men in party platforms and party literature more generally? And the importance of free speech became particularly critical to the anti-slavery movement precisely because there was a background assumption for them that free speech was seriously under threat. That for them, they could not assume that they would be entitled to free speech, instead of something they had to fight for. If anti-slavery advocates like Wendell Phillips in this picture could routinely gather amongst a crowd and try to win them over to his cause through argumentation, through making speeches, then there'd be little to say about free speech per se, but too often they could not. And so I want to emphasize across the rest of this talk three particular problems that anti-slavery forces were concerned about, and how they thought free speech was under threat, and how they needed to push back in defense of free speech relative to these problems. So one is a problem of mobs, a second is the problem of the mail, and the third is the problem of petitions. So let me start with the problem of mobs. Abraham Lincoln, when he was a young lawyer just starting out, spoke in the Young Men's Lyceum of Springfield in 1838. This was a professional organization in which young lawyers and budding politicians gathered to give speeches and make arguments and hone their rhetorical skills in general. And one of Lincoln's very first public speeches has subsequently become famous. And strikingly, at the heart of that speech was an argument about mob violence. He thought mob violence was a much too common feature of Jacksonian America in the 1830s in general, and the speech was dedicated to the denunciation of what he called the mobocratic spirit, the spirit in America of organizing ourselves in rioting mobs rather than participating in politics through democratic elections more generally. And he thought that, in fact, this threat of mobs was so severe that it threatened the very future of Republican government in the United States at all. So as he said, at what point then is the approach of danger to Republican government in the United States to be expected? I answer, if it never reach it, it must spring up amongst us. It cannot come from abroad. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. As a nation of freemen, we must live through all time or die by suicide. And for him, the fear of suicide focused particularly on this threat of mob action. There is, even now, something of ill omen amongst us. I mean the increasing disregard for law which pervades the country, the growing disposition to substitute the wild and furious passions in lieu of the sober judgment of courts, and the worse than savage mobs for the executive ministers of justice. Whenever this effect shall be produced amongst us, whenever the vicious portion of the population shall be permitted to gather in bands of hundreds and thousands and burn churches and ravage and rob provision stores, throw printing presses into rivers, shoot editors, and hang and burn obnoxious persons at pleasure and with impunity, depend on it, this government will not last. Mob violence and riots continue to be a problem perhaps even more so in the years after Lincoln's address. In 1844, for example, students from Princeton University reportedly marched to Philadelphia to take part in what became days of nativist anti-Catholic rioting that included the burning of St. Michael's Church in Philadelphia. Mob violence was a frequent vehicle for silencing anti-slavery speakers and preventing the spread of the anti-slavery message as well. Abolitionist speeches and publications were generally understood to be legal within the United States at the time, though as the nation approached the Civil War, that was less true in the South, and the legality depended upon specific content. But mobs often took matters in their own hands when they could not get satisfaction through the legal process. Cassius Marcellus Clay was a Kentucky politician, a cousin of Henry Clay, and the founder of the Republican Party. Inspired by abolitionism while a student at Yale College, where he heard a speech by the anti-slavery radical William Lloyd Garrison, Clay turned himself into an anti-slavery reformer himself, although he never became a Garrisonian specifically. And as a politician, he once had to use a Bowie knife to defend himself from an armed assailant sent by his pro-slavery opponent. He started an anti-slavery paper in Lexington, Kentucky, but despite arming the press with cannons, his printing equipment was destroyed by a mob, and he moved his operations to Cincinnati. Thomas Marshall, a nephew of Chief Justice John Marshall, was one of the leaders of the mob that broke into Clay's press, and he defended the right of the mob to take such direct action. In Marshall's words, to have prevented the establishment of this press by legal means would have been impossible. There is no regular judicial process by which it could have been achieved. To have resorted to means like the present would have been premature and perhaps indefensible. The liberty of the press and the freedom of public discussion are essential elements of our social system. An effort to establish a press in Kentucky devoted to the discussion of the question of domestic slavery and the propriety and practicality of emancipation by law as an individual enterprise might, in the simple view of the proposition, have been tolerated by the people, as is in all probability not prohibited by the law. But, he said, an abolition paper in a slave state is a nuisance of the most formidable character, a public nuisance, not a mere inconvenience which may occasion delay in business or prove hurtful to the health and comfort, but a blasting brand in the hands of incendiary or madmen, which makes scatter, ruin, conflagration, revolution, crime, unnameable over everything dear in domestic life, sacred in religion or respectable in modesty. Who shall say that when the case of danger, real danger of great and irreparable injury to a whole community really occurs, that is not the armed legally with the right of self-defense. The True American, which is the name of the abolitionist paper that Clay ran, an abolitionist paper of the worst stamp, Marshall thought, and as such, the peace and safety of this community demand its instant and entire suppression. A Lexington jury would not convict anyone of the criminal charges associated with the destruction of Clay's press, although Clay did win a civil suit in a different county. Mob violence against abolitionists extended well beyond the South or even border states like Kentucky. When the New Hampshire Anti-Slavery Society organized a public meeting in Concord in 1835 that was to feature the fiery radical abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, there were threats of violence. In response, the mayor ordered that the town hall where the abolitionists were to meet be closed and that the meeting canceled. The disappointed mob that had gathered to disrupt the meeting searched the town until they found Garrison and attacked him with rocks and sticks until he was able to escape them. The mayor's response in Concord was not unusual for public officials until well into the 20th century. There's a fair question in American law that when someone says something offensive, what is the obligation of the audience in response? Was it appropriate, legally acceptable for the audience to respond with violence against the speaker who had offended them? The standard answer in American law was it was acceptable for mobs to respond to speakers in that way, and as a consequence, the law had to take responsibility for ensuring that those speakers did not arouse mobs to take that kind of violent action. Harry Nation was a prohibitionist speaker in the late 19th and early 20th century who became particularly famous for taking hatchets to saloons, but she also did speaking tours through the United States in which he advocated for alcohol prohibition in general. And it was also routine for her speeches to be disrupted by mobs, for people to get violent in response to her calls to ban alcohol. And as a consequence, it was also routine for her then to be arrested and charged with disturbing the peace. She was guilty of disturbing the peace for angering people to such a degree that they would threaten violence. This was a standard response well into the 20th century. It was certainly the standard response of the law enforcement officials in the 19th century and before the Civil War. When mobs reacted violently against a speech they did not like, police arrested the speaker for disturbing the peace. Just a few years before Cassius Clay moved his printing press to the relative safety of Cincinnati, Ohio, the city had seen a notorious example of mob violence against an earlier anti-slavery newspaper. James Birney was, like Clay, a native of Kentucky. In the 1840s, when Clay was fighting off assailants in Lexington, Birney served as the presidential nominee of the Anti-Slavery Liberty Party. When Birney visited Cincinnati to explore the possibility of using it as a base for an anti-slavery newspaper, one local newspaper, already existent, called for sending the abolitionists, quote, back to the place from whence they came, or if necessary, to simply lynch them. When he considered opening a press in Kentucky, the Louisville paper said, have little doubt that his office would be torn down, but we trust that Mr. Birney himself will receive no personal harm, since he was, after all, an honest and benevolent man, despite his mad notions. During a series of white riots against black residents in Cincinnati in 1836, Birney's press was destroyed not once but twice, and he soon moved to New York City to work for the American Anti-Slavery Society there. In the aftermath of the attack on Birney, another anti-slavery paper tried to find some hope in the ashes. What is the meaning of that mob dragging off a broken printing press? What is the meaning of the crowd around yonder church swearing and throwing stones at a peaceful lecturer? These things certainly do not mean that slaveholders are afraid of losing their character by their misrepresentations of abolitionist presses or lecturers. If that were the fear, they have 100 presses and lecturers to one. Nothing in the world would be easier than to overwhelm the abolitionist libels with disgrace by publishing the whole truth. Truth is great and will prevail, everybody knows. What then is the reason why slaveholders excite their friends and allies to destroy abolitionist papers and interrupt abolitionist lecturers? It is this. They know that abolitionist papers and lectures will convince people that slavery is sinful. And when that is done, they can hold slaves no longer, consistently with their own reputations and peace of mind. It evidently cannot be put down by law, for the very reason why mobs are resorted to is that the law is insufficient. The Constitution guarantees freedom of speech and of the press. Can the abolitionists be put down by mobs? The supporters of slavery, who the abolitionists came to call mobocrats, boasted the mobs were a precise weapon. They might promise that the press would be destroyed, but an honest man like James Birney would not be personally harmed. They might drive a speaker out of town with rocks and clubs, but they would pull up short from doing any real damage. The murder of Elijah Lovejoy in Illinois in the fall of 1837 gave lie to such pretensions. Lovejoy had studied at Princeton Theological Seminary and become a Presbyterian preacher. He launched an anti-slavery paper in St. Louis that was repeatedly destroyed by mobs. He set up a new paper in Illinois and began to organize an anti-slavery society there. When a mob came to once again destroy his printing press, Lovejoy and his friends tried to fight them off. Soon gunfire was exchanged between the two factions and 2 men were killed, one of the mob and Lovejoy himself. No one was convicted for their actions that night, but Lovejoy became a celebrated martyr in the abolitionist movement. The great abolitionist orator and escaped slave Frederick Douglass had his own share of run-ins with pro-slavery mobs. In 1843, he went on a speaking tour of the Midwest. While in Indiana, a mob disrupted his meeting at which he was speaking and charged the platform. Douglass grabbed a club and waded into the crowd, and in the melee, Douglass's hand was broken and he was knocked unconscious. Other abolitionists who were with him were likewise beaten. Eventually, the mob retreated and left the abolitionists to carry away their wounded. Even in Boston, the home of the anti-slavery movement, and even in December 1860, after the Republican Party and Abraham Lincoln won the White House, Douglas and his associates could not count on being able to speak without being molested. As had happened many times before, a mob burst into a Baptist church in which Douglas was on stage and assaulted his audience. Douglas called out, "This is one of the most impudent, bare-faced outrages on free speech I've ever witnessed in Boston or elsewhere." The police eventually cleared the building. The next week, Douglas spoke again elsewhere in Boston, and he added to his prepared speech a few words about what had happened the week before. "We thought the principle of free speech was an accomplished fact. Here, if nowhere else, we thought the right of people to assemble and to express their opinion was secure. But here we are today, contending for what we thought we gained years ago. To suppress free speech is a double wrong. It violates the rights of the hearer as well as the speaker. It is just as criminal to rob a man of his right to speak and to hear as it would be to rob him of his money. I have no doubt that Boston will vindicate this right, but in order to do so, there must be no concession to the enemy. When a man is allowed to speak because he is rich and powerful, it aggravates the crime of denying the rights to the poor and the humble." The pro-slavery mobs did not rely on the law to suppress speech they did not like. The abolitionists could not rely on the law to protect them either. The law of the mid-19th century valued peace over the freedom of speech. The abolitionists stirred strong passions, but they believed that that was evidence that they were succeeding. Douglas's plea was for more robust commitment to the freedom of speech than many Americans of his day were prepared to recognize. He demanded that a free society learn to tolerate even the most divisive opinions. A free people should be able to hear difficult arguments. The principle of free speech was meaningless if it could not be practically asserted by being exercised by peaceful speakers speaking to an interested audience and trying to persuade them of the truth. The battle between the slave power and the abolitionists over freedom of thought in America opened on a second front as well, the control over the males. In the spring of 1835, the American Anti-Slavery Society resolved to pursue a new tactic, to flood the nation with abolitionist literature. Nearly 200,000 copies of abolitionist newspapers passed through the New York Post Office on their way to individuals who might or might not be sympathetic throughout the country. Some 20,000 of those were headed to addresses in the slaveholding South, and the South did not react well. In Charleston, a mob broke into the post office, seized the abolitionist literature, and burned it in the town square in front of a crowd of thousands. Southern governors demanded the abolitionists be extradited to stand trial for their crime of sending abolitionist literature into the South. There's no real risk of that, but there was a more serious debate over how to prevent the Great Postal Campaign of 1835 from ever happening again, and how to keep the slaveholding states free from the scourge of anti-slavery literature. Andrew Jackson was nearing the end of his second term as president. Amos Kendall, a longtime newspaper editor, had been appointed Postmaster General. It was Kendall's job to find a solution. Kendall instructed local postmasters that they had no obligation to distribute the abolitionist materials. He contended that the people of one state had no right to interfere with the domestic policy of another state. Individuals had a right to free discussion within their own state, at least within the limits of local laws, but Kendall denied that anyone had a right to, as he said, carry on such discussions within other communities that did not welcome that conversation. The federal government had a duty to protect each state from domestic violence. It equally had a duty, he thought, not to contribute to the possibility of domestic violence by circulating incendiary papers within those states. In his next annual message, Jackson asked Congress for a more permanent legislative solution. The postal system, he thought, was designed to foster amicable intercourse and correspondence, and Congress should take action to prevent it from being used as an instrument of the opposite character. Senator John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, the effective leader of the pro-slavery forces of the nation, wrote the majority report for a Senate committee charged with considering Jackson's recommendations. Perhaps surprisingly, Calhoun concluded that the national government had no power to control what materials went through the mail. His report turned into a celebration of the First Amendment and the limited powers of the national government to infringe on the freedom of the press. If Congress could prohibit the circulation of publications, it was in effect prohibiting their very publication, since the entire purpose of publishing was to reach an audience, Calhoun argued. Calhoun denied that the federal government had any authority to prevent publishers from finding their audience. If Congress could interfere to keep abolitionist literature out of the mails, Calhoun warned, it could likewise interfere to restrict the press on all subjects, political, moral, and religious, completely to its will and pleasure. Calhoun had not suddenly become a friend of the abolitionists. Rather, he was taking the long view. As usual, he feared that the South recognized federal power here, that power would eventually be turned against it. Each state, he argued, not the federal government, had the primary responsibility for itself to determine how best to secure the public safety. Thus, there was no question in his mind that the states could prevent the circulation of incendiary literature within the borders of the state. The federal government's obligation was not to make that decision for the state, but to cooperate with the execution of the state laws. Federal postmasters should not themselves determine what counted as an incendiary publication. They should take their guidance from local laws, where such publications were to be delivered. Congress was not able to take a clear position on the issue, and many postmasters in the South took it upon themselves to refuse delivery of items in the mail that were at odds with local sensibilities. A third major front of the slave-powered war against freedom of thought came in the halls of Congress and the battle over anti-slavery petitions. The right to petition the government for redress of grievances is enshrined in the First Amendment alongside the freedom of speech and the freedom of the press. The right to petition the government was cherished English inheritance and was a routine feature of early American government that individuals and groups would present petitions to Congress to pressure legislatures to make new policy that petitioners wanted. The norms of the period created an expectation that Congress would deliberate on and respond to those petitions, even if it would not act on the policies the petitioners were advocating. Anti-slavery reformers had long made use of petitions as vehicles to advance their cause. The very process of collecting signatures from neighbors was an important means of spreading the message and identifying those who might be sympathetic to the anti-slavery reforms. But even if the legislative body had not yet inclined to adopt the reforms, the petitioners wanted the presentation of reform petitions to further publicize the cause and perhaps set the stage for future action. As anti-slavery forces ramped up their petitioning activity, pro-slavery forces in Congress grew tired of the repeated challenges to the peculiar institution. Equally disturbing from their perspective was the growing wave of anti-slavery constitutionalism that was beginning to map out a theory of congressional power that could undermine and eventually end slavery in the United States. The slave power did not want federal politicians getting any ambitious ideas. The result was the gag rule. Slaveholders insisted that Congress should not entertain petitions asking it to take actions that were beyond its constitutional powers. Rather than debating anti-slavery constitutionalism on a case-by-case basis and potentially allowing northern politicians to be won over to the anti-slavery cause, the gag rule automatically tabled all abolition petitions without debate. Former President John Quincy Adams had joined the anti-slavery cause and had also joined the House of Representatives. From his perch in the House, he had become one of the leading voices for anti-slavery arguments in the country. He had frequently used petitions to help advance those arguments, and when the gag rule was imposed, he became a tireless critic of it, repeatedly pushing the boundaries and highlighting the ways in which it undermined the traditional right to petition and the free exchange of ideas in the Congress itself. The gag rule became yet another example of how the slaveocracy was bent on suppressing free speech and preventing anti-slavery advocates from taking their arguments to the people. An emerging theme of anti-slavery advocacy was the battle over slavery was ultimately a battle over those who were willing to make arguments and use persuasion to advance their cause, and those who were only willing to use force to silence their opponents and maintain their power. The attack on Massachusetts Republican Senator Charles Sumner by South Carolina Democratic Representative Preston Brooks in 1856 dramatized the dichotomy. Sumner was beaten nearly to death on the floor of the Senate for the crime of criticizing slavery and the slaveholders. Brooks was soon enthusiastically reelected to the House by his supportive constituents, while enjoying a newfound celebrity amongst other slaveholders generally. Abolitionist cartoons, such as this one, echoed the message of innumerable reports, speeches, sermons, pamphlets, and newspaper articles. The Southern idea of liberty, as the cartoon characterized it, was one in which those supporting the cause of Declaration, all men are born free and equal, were to be condemned and subjected to violence as a warning to northern fanatics who advanced the anti-slavery cause. The maintenance of slavery required a closing of the American mind. The abolitionists could comfort in the notion that slaveholders feared a free and open debate. The slaveholders knew that they did not have the truth on their side, and that they would be unable to persuade Americans of their position if their critics could be heard. The consequence of the increasingly heated battle over the future of slavery was a growing appreciation of the importance and implication of commitment to freedom of thought in the United States. The abolitionists rarely called for reconsideration of the basic constitutional and legal framework that structured the kinds of speech government could regulate. No new First Amendment jurisprudence emerged out of this battle between the slaveholders and the abolitionists. What did emerge was a new appreciation of freedom of thought in various ways in which it could be suppressed, and even beyond the use of criminal law to punish those who engaged in disfavored speech. Those who opposed the slavery regime came to realize that free speech was an essential handmaid to their cause. Free speech was something they would have to fight for in order to be able to carry out the fight against slavery. They likewise celebrated the ultimate abolition of slavery as a victory for the freedom of thought. The abolitionists might not have won every battle over free speech in the years leading up to the Civil War, but they thought they had won the war. They had won the war not merely in the literal sense of defeating the Confederacy on the battlefield, but they had also won the war in the figurative sense, having dramatically moved public opinion in the North on the slavery question, having built a new anti-slavery party that was capable of winning elections, and having converted a war over union into a war over slavery. Anti-slavery advocates maintained their optimism that the truth would win out, but they needed a national commitment to freedom of thought in order for the truth to have a chance. So thank you very much, and we've got some time for any questions you might have.
Questions for Professor Whittington?
Yeah.
First of all, thank you very much. This is incredibly interesting. I learned a lot. So you used the word truth a lot.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, when you think about kind of the modern times and kind of what truth means or doesn't.
Yeah, for sure.
So, right. So how does some of the ideas that you mentioned today, how do you think that translates to, do you think that has anything, I'll let you answer.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, so certainly the argument of this period certainly turns on slightly different language than we use now. The structure of the argument is not that distant from how we often argue about these things ourselves. Certainly part of what slaveholders wanted to argue with these debates of the abolitionists were circulating misinformation across the country, and from their perspective, there's a question about how do you suppress that. Likewise, the abolitionists thought that the slaveholders were circulating misinformation and propaganda across the country, and likewise they had to think about how you respond to that. Interestingly, their response was one of trying to open the door to more speech, that they thought could overwhelm the misinformation coming from the South with an appeal to the truth. And so you get this sort of very optimistic feature of anti-slavery thought relative to this, which I think it partially is born from earlier religious thought as well. It's striking the extent to which a lot of the early free speech arguments about government and secular arguments that emerge in the 17th, 19th century come after a period of similar kinds of arguments about right of religious conscience and free conscience that emerge in the 16th century. Those arguments get secularized, but they sort of rest on very similar foundations, and they're very similar in structure as to how the arguments are approached. And of course, those earlier religious arguments were ones that emphasized the optimism of thinking truth will win out. That God was on your side. If you only get his word out, if people would needed space in order to allow the Word of God to move forward. And of course, the anti-slavery cause was likewise suffused with religious activism and a lot of very similar kinds of religious thinking as well. The truth was on their side, and they just needed to be able to get it out there and get people to hear it. So there was a particular, so truth, I think, had a particular kind of resonance for them that was not just one about the facts of what was happening in the South, although that's part of what they wanted to convey as well, but also truth about certain kinds of values and commitments that they thought were fundamental. And that if those arguments could be explained to people, they were optimistic that people would be persuaded and would convert to their cause if only they knew what the truth was. Right? And you had the opportunity to go and convey it. Yeah.
Moving forward in time
Yeah.
to the present day, we read and hear a lot of situations of speakers not allowed to speak in colleges and so on, and including your institution.
Yeah.
Can you clarify a little bit as to what the trend is right now and what's going on?
Well, I think there's certainly a struggle over this at the moment as well. And part of that struggle is precisely over, I'm emphasizing this talk, is exactly over this kind of mob action and how to think about it, right? And so the kind of concern that Frederick Douglass raises is interesting in this regard, because Frederick Douglass primarily, when he makes this argument in 1860 about free speech, is not really an argument about what constitutional law requires. It's not one about sort of changing constitutional jurisprudence. Particularly, you see a lot of those arguments emerging in other contexts and later in American history. That's not primarily his argument. Instead, his argument is one primarily about how civil society ought to think about these kind of controversial opinions, and how the law ought to respond to disturbances of peace, and who ought to be blamed and held responsible for that. So from Douglas's perspective, in a free society, law enforcement officials had a particular responsibility for maintaining a space in which you could have controversial arguments, and that their priority ought to be how does this preserve that space for argumentation, rather than the priority being how do you suppress the possibility of violence, which is how law enforcement at the time tended to look at it and think about it. And I think that remains a central concern. It's not until pretty late in the 20th century that before it winds up this kind of argument gets framed as one about the heckler's veto. Ultimately, if you have an offended audience, could they marshal formal governmental power to shut down speakers they dislike? Can they simply act as an unruly mob and disrupt speeches they dislike? And can they do that with impunity? It's not until very late in the 20th century that the U.S. Supreme Court comes around thinking that's a real problem and it ought to be incorporated into constitutional jurisprudence. And I think we still struggle with it as a question of sort of civil society and sort of our own inclinations about how troubling we find it to have speeches be disrupted when we have speakers that we disagree with, to what degree is it important to preserve space even for speech that offends us, that challenges us, that we think is wrong in various ways. I think in some ways the kind of challenge that Douglass is facing on the free speech front is a challenge that remains with us. And we certainly see it on college campuses, we see it other places as well. And I think as Lincoln noted, I think these are persistent features of the human condition and sort of temptations of humans to try to suppress those kinds of ideas that they find particularly disturbing. And the challenge is how do you convince people that that's not how society and politics ought to be organized, and instead we ought to settle our disputes through words rather than through force. But unfortunately, I think that remains our challenge today in many ways as well. Yeah.
How do you distinguish, or how do you combat, I'm not sure what the right word is, but if somebody's given a talk or whatever, free speech, and he gets sued for hate speech.
Right.
How can we work toward resolving somebody being taken to court for expressing their views?
Well, of course, in the United States, not very likely to happen, right? I mean, hate speech is not recognized by the Supreme Court as an exception to the First Amendment. While not true in Europe and Canada, there's more restrictions on hate speech as it's characterized, and legal remedies against that in that context. And so far, the U.S. Supreme Court has been willing to turn aside arguments that say we ought to carve out exceptions for hate speech, just like we carved out other kinds of exceptions to First Amendment protections, that we recognize that there are situations in which speech might be so dangerous that it's appropriate for it to be suppressed. For example, we recognize that certain kinds of false speech does injury to people in ways that we can reasonably suppress it. The court continues to recognize that obscenity is outside the bounds of First Amendment protections and can be suppressed. And so likewise, we've seen arguments that say we ought to carve out various other kinds of exceptions, and one of the kinds of exceptions that get advocated for is a hate speech exception as well. The court so far has been very resistant to that.
You can shut somebody down by calling it hate speech, whether, who decides if it's hate speech or if it's freedom of speech?
Yeah, well, that is part of the challenge of censorship regimes in general, is that the question of who gets to make those decisions. And so we've seen over the last few decades waves of speech codes adopted by universities that's partially motivated by hate speech. More recently, certainly they get framed as hate speech codes in particular. And one thing that's striking about the experience of those before a lot of them got struck down, in public universities at least, one of the striking features of a lot of those codes is that the very people who are advocating for those codes would ultimately find themselves on the wrong end of them down the road, right? That they empower university administrators to make that decision about what example of controversial speech is occurring on our campus is too disruptive, too troubling, too problematic, too hurtful to people, and we need to shut it down. You always imagine when you're the one writing the code, it's my opponents that are the ones to get shut down, not me. But instead, it turns out college administrators have their own agendas, and they're ultimately often like law enforcement officials. In these contexts, they mostly just want to make controversies go away. And that sometimes means punishing people who are making very unpopular speech of various sorts. And that's certainly part of what the abolitionists were recognizing as well, right? That if you have to empower somebody to make those determinations, and part of what cleverly John C. Calhoun was worried about as well, right? Who gets to make the determination as what counts in incendiary publication? And from Calhoun's perspective, I'm not going to trust the National Postmaster General, who might sometimes be friendly, might sometimes not be so friendly to the slavery cause. I want to trust the local South Carolina officials, because they'll be on the right side of this in a more consistent way, right? And so it's fighting over what speech gets regulated is partially a fight about the standards and identification of the content of speech that ought to be regulated, but it's also a fight over who gets to make that decision. And certainly one of my concerns about embracing restrictions on speech is I have a great deal of distrust of the people who wind up holding that position. And if you have a lot of faith and people are going to make those decisions, you're more comfortable with these kinds of speech code regimes. I just don't think you ought to be very confident about how that's going to play out over time. And certainly I don't think that's been our experience over time.
I'm afraid we've run out of time. I'm sorry. We're already past our deadline. Students are going to get to class at 1 o'clock. Could you please join me in thanking Professor Whittington?
April 6, 2021, I was sitting in my office and an email popped into my inbox from someone in your graduating class today. The email said, "Dear President Docking, back in August I had emailed you in regards to the state of the well-being of the campus community during the COVID spike. At that time, I was incredibly anxious about the prospect of spending my senior year of college sitting at my kitchen table in my hometown trying to finish my seminar projects in the event we switched to all online learning. As I type this email now in April, I cannot describe to you the gratitude that my fellow students and I have for Adrian remaining open on campus for the duration of the school year. I wanted to take the time to thank the Adrian College community, the faculty, the staff, for allowing us to have as normal of a year as possible in a world that simply did not want that to happen. I look forward to walking across the stage in May knowing that I was still able to enjoy time with my friends and the Bulldog community during my senior year. All the best, Max Birmingham, class of 2021. Max, you've got to stand up so we can give you a round of applause. For those of us on this stage, today is one of the most exciting days of the year. We love to see the wonder and anticipation in the eyes of our new students, as all of you anxiously await all of the amazing experiences that will define the years ahead.